Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jajean Rose-Burney, the Deputy Director of the Western New York Land Conservancy, and I'm joined by Ed Marx of the Wildlands Network. It's over the next next hour, both Ed and I will give a presentation. I'm going to start off with the Allegany Wildlands. This is a 200-acre forest near Allegheny State Park that the community right now is trying to save and protect. And then Ed will talk about how that fits into the Eastern Wildway, which is an ambitious plan to connect the forests of the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Quebec, through our region, through the Appalachians. Really, really exciting. Before we get started, I do want to thank a few people. Kyle Semmel, our communications manager, for organizing everything tonight. Kara Frasina, who's on this with us, who's running all of the IT and making sure everything shows up on YouTube so you can see it. I want to thank the Friends of the Allegany Wildlands. So this is a volunteer group that's helping raise money to save the Allegany Wildlands. And I'd like to thank everyone who's already donated to save the Allegany Wildlands. And if you haven't already, I'm a fundraiser, so I just want to point out that you can donate. We still need help. And you can do that on our website or send a check to the Western New York Land Conservancy. I'll talk about that later. I'd also like to thank all of the Land Conservancy board and staff for being part of this important work. So now I'm going to start off with a presentation about the Allegany Wildlands. Bear with me as I share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. And so here we go. All right, so I think a lot of you might know this already. Some of you might be new, even new to the Land Conservancy. But we're working to save a property called the Allegany Wildlands. This is a 200-acre forest down near Allegheny State Park. This is the southern tier, south of Buffalo, near the Pennsylvania border. It's a really spectacular forest. Great views of a nearby reservoir, great wildlife, even American chestnuts, which is a tree that's almost disappeared from our landscape, but we have American chestnuts at this property. And unfortunately, the property's threatened. If we don't protect it, if we don't buy it, it will be developed, it will be logged. And we have until the end of this year to raise $879,000 to be able to buy the land, build a walking trail so everyone can experience it, and be able to protect the land and steward the land in the long run. And so let me start off too, just by, I guess, giving you an overview of the Western New York Land Conservancy, because some of you, I think, will be new to us. So we're a land trust. In Western New York, we're a not-for-profit. We've been around for 30 years. We've helped protect 7,000 acres of land, more than 90 properties. We have a lot of nature preserves. We protect a lot of farms. We are working with communities and landowners to try to protect the places that matter most to us, that are the most important, that have the most important biodiversity and wildlife habitat. It's always voluntary. We're always working in places that want us, and we're always working with landowners who want us to help. And this example, this is a photo of the College Lodge Forest. This is a really amazing forest in Chautauqua County that we raised money for with the community last year to be able to buy. This is the wetland. There's 450-year-old hemlocks on this forest. So pretty soon, within a few months, we expect to own this forest. There's already trails there to be open to the public. It's a really awesome nature preserve. This is a little waterfall at what we call Mossy Point. So this is at the headwaters of the Niagara River. Just last year, we purchased this 200-acre property. This is right in the middle of a huge county forest adjacent to one of our other nature preserves. So together with this Mossy Point and the county park and our nature reserve, it's 1,100 acres of protected forest along more than 2 miles of both sides of this creek, which is at the headwaters of the Niagara River. And we're just building a trail system now. That walking trail system at Mossy Point will be open early next year. A few years ago, we were able to buy a 29-acre property on the Niagara River called the Stella Niagara Preserve. So it's a 1/4 mile of shoreline. There's a natural landing right on the Niagara River. It's a place where indigenous communities had launched canoes for millennia. This is where the British landed during the War of 1812 when they captured Fort Niagara. And now we own it. It's a publicly accessible nature preserve. The Sisters of St. Francis sold this to us, which is why there's a little chapel. And now it's protected forever. And you can go and touch the water and put a kayak in the water right down at the Allegheny Reserve. We also do a lot of habitat restoration. This is a photo of the Niagara Gorge, just below the falls. We're doing a large multi-year habitat restoration project there, trying to control the non-native invasive plants, especially things like Norway maple and ailanthus that have really started taking over the gorge. And the gorge is one of the more diverse, I guess, plant floristically places in the entire Great Lakes region. And so controlling these invasive species and restoring the native forest there is really important for a variety of, endangered species and protected species, and even, ancient old growth white cedars sticking out of the gorge. And so we do a lot of habitat restoration. We're also creating what's called the Riverline, which is a new nature trail and greenway right in the city of Buffalo along an unused railroad corridor near the Buffalo River. And the idea here is that we want to connect people to nature right where they live, right in the middle of the city, connect people to the waterfront, connect people to nature, and connect these communities to each other that have been separated by this unused railroad infrastructure for a long time. And like I said, we also protect a lot of farmland throughout the region, really a lot of cool farms, CSAs, organic farms. And, obviously having farmland is important because we need food, and we grow a lot of our food right here in Western New York, and having farmland protected means that we'll always be able to grow our own food right here in Western New York. So that's the overview of who the Land Conservancy is. Let's get back to the Allegany Wildlands. So this is like I said, a 200-acre forest near Allegheny State Park. It's overlooking the reservoir on the other side of Allegheny State Park. The Allegany Wildlands is connected to 7,000 acres of protected state forests. Allegheny State Park nearby is almost 56,000 acres. And the Allegheny National Forest just south in Pennsylvania is hundreds of thousands of acres. So this 200-acre property is connected to this really large system of protected forests. And this is an aerial just showing where that Allegany Wildlands property is, this 200 acres overlooking the reservoir. And we did a drone video, and we're just about to show you that video. It's a really cool video. It's a really spectacular place, great views of this hill. This is the Allegany Wildlands overlooking the reservoir. And I'm going to stop sharing and let Kara show a quick video about the Allegany Wildlands. Thank you, Kara. We hired someone named Calvin Nemec who put that video together for us, and we used some of our own video of some of the wildlife that we found there. it's a really cool place. Let me share my screen again so you can see my slides and that have more about the Allegheny Wildlands. And I want to just scroll through a few of the, just a few more photos. There's some of the trees, sloping hills, colors in the fall. Is a hemlock forest on a ravine towards the back of the property. Really neat little meandering streams and ravines along the hill, all draining into the reservoir. Jamie Hogard is a photographer who helped take some really, really neat photos of some of all these mosses. Winter too, beautiful there during the winter. All right, so one of the things that makes the Allegheny Wildlands really unique and really special is that it's part of the Allegheny Plateau. And this map, you can see that yellow is the Allegheny Plateau. That red line is the boundary, it's the extent of the last ice age. The glaciers, the last ice age, never went further south than that red line. And so what that means is the Allegheny Wildlands, which is south of that red line, wasn't covered by glaciers during the last ice age. The soils weren't scoured by the glaciers, the forests weren't taken out by the glaciers. And so this Allegheny Wildlands is one of the few places in New York State that wasn't covered by glaciers. And what that's done is it's allowed this ecosystem to sort of develop over many hundreds of thousands of years, longer than a lot of other places in New York State that were covered by glaciers and scoured by glaciers. And so this is a joke prefacing that, but I was looking for a photo. What did it look like when it was right at the edge of the glaciers? And the only thing I could find online was a photo. This is from, Ice Age. And this is what it would have looked like at the Allegheny Wildlands, at the edge of the glaciers, still forested, wildlife still there, but not covered by the glaciers. And so again, all of that diversity that has resulted, and it makes this property special, given that geologic history. We started working on this project last November. Eric Danielson went out. Marisa Rigi helped find this property. Our conservation director, Eric Danielson, went out to survey it, what's there, as we're sort of exploring whether or not we should work on this, whether or not we should protect it. And what Eric found is just a really incredible diversity of plants, especially. One thing that he noted that is interesting is that there's this ridge in red it's an Allegheny oak forest, a type of forest that has a lot of diversity of oaks, red oaks, white oaks, black oaks. In the understory, there's a lot of spring ephemerals, violets. These are yellow violets, trillium, a lot of really great black cohosh, blue cohosh. He found a population of what's called blunt-lobed grape fern, which is a protected plant in New York State. And he now has found, I think, a population, it's almost 30% of the known specimens, living examples of blunt-lobed grape fern in the entire state of New York are on this 200-acre property. He found orchids. One of the orchids is a rattlesnake plantain. So a lot of people think that orchids are only things that you find in tropical rainforests and you buy at Home Depot and greenhouses. But we have a lot of native orchids in Western New York. And one of them is this rattlesnake plantain, which the flower itself isn't very showy, but the leaves are very showy. And we found a few other orchid species, beautiful orchids, native orchids flowering at the Allegheny Wildlands. And another thing that he found that I thought was really intriguing was he found an American chestnut. And I had never seen an American chestnut. When I saw this map, I said, I want to go explore this property too. I want to find this American chestnut. I've never seen one in the wild in a natural forest. And so a lot of you might know this, but the American chestnut used to be a dominant tree in the Alleghenies, in the Appalachians, the East Coast in general. A massive tree, and it was culturally important. The chestnut itself was a food source for indigenous communities and our ancestors and everyone who's come and lived in this region, going back 100 years would have eaten American chestnuts. And unfortunately, even for wildlife, so the American chestnut was an important food source for wildlife, one of the important food sources for wildlife. But about 100 years ago, a blight from Europe wiped out the American chestnut. It's a fungus, and it killed almost all of the trees. These massive trees all died. You're seeing that sort of thing happen today with ash and even hemlock. The American chestnut was a much more significant, large portion of our forest, bigger trees. And so losing it was really, really devastating. But what's happened is a lot of American chestnuts, essentially they're wiped off the landscape. But some of the root systems survived, and every once in a while they send up shoots. And so in some forests you can find, essentially what look like shrubs, very small shrubby looking chestnuts that grow a little bit and then die off. The blight's still there, the fungus is still there. But every once in a while they'll send up a shoot, and the shoot will live 10, 20, 30 years. And at the Allegheny Wildlands, Eric had found that one. We now know there are 6 at the Allegheny Wildlands American chestnuts that are between 40 and 60 feet tall. Some of them are even flowering and producing seeds. And so this is really important, to help with the survival of the species, having a population at one property like this, 6 that are large, some flowering, some producing seeds. We think there are more American chestnuts of that size at the Allegheny Wildlands than anywhere outside of Zoar Valley in Western New York. So it's really important that we protect this place so the American chestnuts here can survive and persist. And this is just me, the first time my wife and I, we went out there and we found the American chestnut, these really cool serrated leaves. I'd never seen one before, so it was really neat to be able to find one. And it was just, like I said, great wildlife, black bear, bobcat, in that reservoir, there are river otter, porcupine, lots of salamanders. There's getting down towards the Appalachians, there's a really high diversity of salamanders here, and birds too, really great bird life. The Allegheny Wildlands, it's in an area that has been internationally designated for its bird diversity. It's a globally significant, important bird area, international designation for places that have incredible diversity of birds. And this is a designation shared with places like the Niagara River, but also with the Galapagos and the Everglades and Yellowstone. So this is a designation for places that are really special. And this important bird area covers most of Allegheny State Park and the forests around it, and that includes the Allegheny Wildlands that we're trying to protect. And it's designated because it has such a high diversity of songbirds in particular, wood warblers, scarlet tanagers like you see here, Blackburnian warblers, indigo buntings, black-throated blue warblers, chestnut-sided warblers, hooded warblers, and a lot more. So when you go there in the spring, early summer, just the trees are just full of bird song and colorful birds. It's really, really, really cool. And mourning warblers, so this is a bird that's hard to find in our area, but we have nesting pairs of mourning warblers at the Allegheny Wildlands. The cerulean warbler, I haven't found it yet, but the cerulean warbler is a declining species, a really rare warbler that nests in forests in the Appalachians and also big floodplain forests. And so the Allegheny Wildlands could potentially have cerulean warblers, given where it is and what it's like and where other nesting cerulean warblers are nearby. So it has the potential to have a lot of really cool birds. I've counted and seen a lot of really important species there too. And one thing that's really important about the Allegheny Wildlands is it's our way of kicking off what we're calling the Western New York Wildway. And so like Ed is about to talk about, the Eastern Wildway, the Western New York Wildway is a way for us to connect the last remaining large forests in our region together so that wildlife can move across the landscape like they once did, so that wildlife that has been extirpated or disappeared from the region can come back, and so that wildlife can move and find new habitats as climate changes. As habitats change with climate, wildlife, plants, and animals are going to have to move to find new suitable habitats if they're going to survive. And that's only going to be possible if we connect the big forests in our region together so that plants and animals can actually move across the landscape and not run into, say, cities or highways or land that doesn't really support them. And so the Western New York Wildway, which is something we're just beginning to think about, that map was a draft map, just so, the boundaries are all, in the works. It's going to be part of the Eastern Wildway. So this effort to connect the forests all the way from the Gulf of Mexico along the eastern US into Canada. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed and Marx to talk about the Wildlands Network and the Eastern Wildway. And before I do that, I just want to introduce him a little bit more than I did before. So Ed Marx is the Northeast Wildlands Ambassador for Wildlands Network. He conducts outreach and develops collaborative partnerships in New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Ed joined the Wildlands Network in 2019 after retiring from his position as Commissioner of Planning and Sustainability for Tompkins County in New York. that's in the Ithaca area. And Ed wanted to turn his attention to his passion for wildlands. Right now, Ed lives in Skaneateles, which I think is where he is right now, presenting in New York. And that's where he and his partner enjoy hiking, kayaking, Finger Lakes, and Lake Ontario, and the Adirondacks. So, Ed, would you like to take it away?
Thank you. And happy to join you all tonight. Just a little bit about Wildlands Network. Wildlands Network is a North American conservation organization, and our mission is to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America so that life in all its diversity can thrive. We do this through a number of activities. We have a science team that does research on the ground throughout the wildways, and we have not just the Eastern Wildway, but we have a Pacific and a Western Wildway also. And they do such things as help recovery of endangered species, such as the red wolf in North Carolina, the jaguar in the Southwest US and Northwest Mexico, landscape analysis to identify important corridors for connectivity and how to strategize protection of those corridors. And road ecology. One of the biggest barriers to wildlife is our highways, especially our major interstates. And so finding out how to accommodate wildlife movement across or through or under, more often than not, those interstates is an important activity. So why is a wildway important? I'm going to talk a little bit about basically three basic themes here. What is the problem? And that's threats to biodiversity. Why is that such a problem? And why do we need to put so much effort into it? The solution, Wildlands and Wildways, that our organization proposes as a way to protect biodiversity in the future, in the present, and also some of the conservation planning strategies for wildland and habitat connectivity that are essential to actually realizing the vision of a wildway in North America.
And Ed, I just wanted to point out, if you are going to be sharing slides, we don't see them yet. I don't know if you would.
Oh, you don't?
No.
I'm sorry. I've got them up on my screen. Let me see what's going on. Okay. Try sharing screen again. Is it coming up? Okay, I'm trying to share screen and it doesn't seem to be coming up.
When you do the share screen, do you see the option for the slideshow?
Yeah, there we go. I think I got to do that. Okay. There we go. You got it now?
Yep, we're seeing it now. Thank you.
Okay, so sorry about that, but those first slides didn't have a lot of content, so that's okay. But again, the overview is to look at the problem, the solution, and some of the strategies. So what is the problem? Well, it's really been a global assault on nature over the last 100+ years. And more recently, since 1970, we've seen some very steep declines in biodiversity across the globe. A number of organizations such as World Wildlife Fund, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, International Union for Conservation of Nature have all come out with studies showing some of these declines: 60% global decline in vertebrate populations, 30% decline in North American birds since 1970, annual declines of global massive insects that, when you compound that over time, is really frightening. And the oceans have been so fished out of large fish that 90% of what once existed in terms of large fish in the ocean are gone. It's a really frightening scene that we are facing. And what are the threats? What is causing this? Well, the primary one is habitat loss and destruction. Just realized I don't have it on slideshow here. Let me fix that. Yes, so the biggest threat is habitat loss and destruction. And it's just basically man appropriating more of the planet for our purposes and often leaving it in very bad shape. Species persecution, overexploitation, that's particularly true of fisheries in the ocean, but also overhunting of some species. And even today we see the wolf just delisted from Endangered Species Act, probably prematurely being persecuted really in some states where they're recovering. Pollution of all types that impact the ability of species to survive. Invasive species and disease. We certainly see this with a lot of the threats to our native trees that are coming from invasive species. And then climate change, the emerging threat that we don't fully understand yet, but we know is already causing problems for a number of the species as the limits of their ability to survive in terms of temperature, water, all sorts of things are being threatened. So what is the solution? Renowned Harvard biologist Edward O. Wilson in 2016, I believe it was, published his book Half Earth, where he posited that in order to save the planet from mass extinction event, we need to protect in some manner about half of the planet. And that's based on principles of conservation biology that have been studied and kind of verified in the field. So the Eastern Wildway is looking at where is the potential for core areas and connective corridors in Eastern North America. And somewhat by coincidence, but perhaps not totally, it basically shows what would be a half-Earth plan for eastern part of the United States and Canada. So what is a wildway and what makes it up? Large protected core areas are really important. Many species require large habitat areas to survive. So that's the kind of fundamental building block. You know, where can we do those? And basically it's got to be built around lands that have been protected to date. Federal and state forests and natural areas and national parks are primarily the centerpieces of these cores. And we really need to do more to protect adjacent lands and expand those. And these cores in and of themselves aren't really going to do the trick totally. There needs to be connectivity, and I'll explain a little bit more in a minute why that's so important. But so you want to have corridors of suitable landscape habitat for species to be able to successfully move from one core to another. In some cases within those corridors, you want to have what's called stepping stones, other protected areas where a species that's moving can find safe place to rest, to find food before moving on and finding its way to a larger core area. And then the concept of a permeable landscape within which this kind of these cores and corridors would be a matrix for within which they would exist is really important too, because species are going to need to move beyond any artificial boundaries in the landscape in order to meet all of their needs. No amount of protected land that we're really going to be able to achieve in the near term is going to be sufficient for a larger number of species alone. So maintaining a landscape that's friendly to as many wildlife species as possible. So why is connectivity so important? Well, first of all, just as food and cover, many species need to cover large areas to meet their needs, both daily and seasonally. And so, you know, they need to be able to move through the landscape and take advantage of all the habitat that would be available to them. For breeding, finding a mate, many species travel a ways to find mates. And again, they may not find the mate in a localized, protected piece of landscape. Gene exchange. This is kind of a connection between populations. An isolated population may be able to reproduce, but over time, their genetic diversity will erode and they become more susceptible to disease oftentimes, or different characteristics from inbreeding that are not helpful to survival. And so by having the ability for a member of one population to migrate and breed with a member of another population, that gene exchange occurs and it keeps populations' genetic diversity strong. Changing climate, of course, as conditions change, mostly warming and often drying, species will need to maybe move north, maybe move up in elevation, maybe move to areas that retain greater amounts of moisture. And so having that landscape connectivity and permeability to allow species to adjust and adapt their ranges to climatic conditions will be critical. And finally, population recovery. We know that disease, major storms like hurricanes, sometimes can deplete, or if not wipe out, entire population of a species. And species from another, members of that species from another area can repopulate suitable habitat if they can get to it. But that's not going to happen if there's not connectivity in the landscape. So the Eastern Wildway in New York, as you see here, really the major component is the Adirondacks. And just to the south of the border, as was mentioned earlier, is a large area of habitat in Pennsylvania. And so from a continental perspective, maintaining connectivity between those two big areas, which also then link up into Canada and the Northeast and down into the Central Appalachians, is really important. And that's part of what the New York Wildway, Eastern Wildway in New York will try to do. So a little bit of context for habitat connectivity in New York. Through the early 1900s, pretty much almost all of New York State was logged. Very little native old growth forest remained in most areas. But over the course of the 20th century, there was a lot of forest recovery as poor farmland was abandoned, mainly as the cause. And so we retained and restored to the landscape about 60% of the land area of New York as forest by the end of the 20th century. And that persisted into the early part of the 21st century. But it's starting to be impacted by development in the current time. And we are at risk of seeing a declining forest base in New York. Also, what's protected, you see here an area north of Allegheny State Park. We've got a lot of protected areas, but they're very fragmented. And although the landscape looks pretty good in many places now, a lot of the private land could be susceptible to changes in land use that would fragment and interrupt the connectivity of that landscape. So basically, we need to add to those existing protected areas to create larger cores, buffer those core areas with good land use planning and management, and connect cores with corridors, and maintaining a permeable landscape to the extent possible. So this is just an example of, when you look at it from an aerial view, you may see all forest, but what's actually protected in many cases looks more like this. And so if the land use on the adjacent land changes such that it's not high quality forest habitat anymore, many species won't do well in that fragment. You get edge effects, particularly for a lot of forest bird species, where 1,000 feet in from the edge may not be very good habitat for them. So in a place like this, if the land use around it changed dramatically, very little good quality forest habitat might remain. And a lot of species are dependent upon these extensive forests. And some that have really extended their ranges in New York since middle of the 20th century are these three characters. Our black bears, bobcats, and fishers have actually been extending their range in the last 50 years, I would say. But if forests become more fragmented or are cleared for other uses or are degraded, then these species, they may retreat from the ranges they've been able to occupy. Just the idea of a permeable landscape, I think, is really important because we know there's only so much land that can be protected in the near term. Over the long term, who knows what's possible, but in the near term, we will be able to protect some of these key pieces, and they are critical. But to the extent possible, we need to figure out what else we can do in the landscape also to maintain that ability of species to move through a rural landscape. So some things that can be done through a number of means, through regulation, and I'll talk about some of those tools in a minute, but buffering streams. Stream corridors are critical for water quality, but also for movement of wildlife that will follow those stream buffers if they are buffered with natural vegetation. Protecting wetland and riparian areas, maintaining stretches of undeveloped road frontage. When all of our road frontage gets split up and divided into housing lots, a lot of species will not move. We'll see that as a barrier, like a wall that they won't move through. And so we need to maintain areas where species can move across and through the landscape. Maintaining compatible land uses in buffer areas. Agriculture and forestry are the two primary ones, some recreational uses. But other activities may not be compatible, like heavy industry, commercial development, large subdivisions. Maintaining habitat patches. There's certain species that have specific habitat needs, that there may be patches of landscape that aren't necessarily part of the cores that should be important to protect. And pathways of continuous vegetative cover. We know that species, a lot of them won't cross an agricultural field. Some research in Vermont showed that bobcats would just stop at the edge, but if there was a hedgerow or there's a wetland edge or something they could follow, they would move on and follow that to get to the next large patch of habitat. So it's important that those areas be maintained in the landscape. And also very important is bridge and culvert design, both for aquatic species so that the water can flow in a way that species can move under roads, but also those can be ways for other wildlife to move through the landscape and avoid the problem with vehicle collisions and mortality from that. How do we get there? What are the things that we can do? Well, one that's being talked about tonight, land acquisition from willing sellers, is going to be really important. And we stress the willing sellers because we are not out there trying to force anybody to do anything. But many people have the desire to see their land protected or maintained in a natural state or in a good managed state. And working with these landowners is really important. That's what land trusts do so well, land conservancies. Conservation easements is part of that, especially on forest lands. Maintaining our forests is really important, and we'd love to see that 60% overall forest cover maintained or even expanded as New York State looks at climate mitigation, having more carbon in our forests will be an important component of reaching our climate goals. Local land use planning and regulation. First of all, recognizing important conservation areas in local land use plans, and then putting into place where appropriate regulations to limit inappropriate types of development. Things like conservation, zoning, and subdivision can really help to maintain the connectivity landscape even when limited development does occur. Providing incentives for landowners for good ecological management of their property, such as forest tax advantages, or even direct payments to landowners for doing restoration work, for example. And public infrastructure investments, as I mentioned, in particular road crossings, but also many water supplies, depend on a watershed that's allowing water to run off in a pure, unpolluted state. And so the headwater streams that feed into public water supplies are an important place to invest in green infrastructure, protecting those forests as a way of protecting our water. And finally, habitat restoration, where the habitat doesn't exist to connect core areas, it may be necessary to restore habitat to allow that to happen. And it's not just something that's happening in North America, New York State, or Western New York, but right now the 15th United Nations Biodiversity Conference is underway. It'll be continuing through the spring. And the New York Times recently reported that the early recommendations that are coming out of that are that each country needs to create a plan about where to conduct those activities that will impact natural areas and limit those so that remaining intact natural areas can be protected. To ensure that wild species are hunted and fished sustainably and safely, if they're hunted and fished at all, so that, you know, we're not 7 billion plus people and a limited number of many species, we can't really, you know, put the pressure on them that we are in many cases. Reducing all kinds of pollution, particularly from agriculture and plastics. Using ecosystems to help with climate change mitigation by storing carbon in forests and grasslands. And then reducing things that are going on that are working against us, where subsidies are actually encouraging development of undeveloped lands that are really important for biodiversity. And finally, the one that we're hoping to see legislation passed in New York and that the Biden administration has embraced is the idea of safeguarding 30% of the plants, land, and oceans by 2030. And every action we take to protect another piece of land can help us reach that goal. So when you think about these, it's sometimes hard to envision how does this really play out in an environment that we're familiar with. But if you look at this kind of diagram that was done by Wildlife Conservation Society, I think a few years back, you can imagine a landscape that looks a lot like much of upstate New York, Western New York, Central New York, where you do have a mix of agriculture and forest lands and some rural residential development, but also some protected areas of forest. And with a little bit of effort and good management and protecting things like riparian areas and maintaining adequate places for wildlife to cross roads and things, we can maintain that connectivity that will allow wildlife to thrive in the landscape. So not only do I say thank you for inviting me here tonight, but this little guy will say thank you if you're successful in protecting the Allegheny Highlands and other work in the future, because it's really all about sharing the planet with all of the other species. We're one of millions, and they have a right to be here and thrive and exist as much as we do, in my opinion. So that's what it's all about in the end. It's making a place that allows all that diversity of life that we cherish and enjoy so much, and that brings meaning really to many of our lives, a place to be there forever in the future. And Wildlands Network certainly welcomes your interest in our organization if you have any. We're accessible and are pretty easy because it's just wildlandsnetwork.org to find out more about us. And with that, I'll turn it back.
Great, thank you, Ed. That was great. Yeah, we're really excited to have, to be a part of the Eastern Wildway, and, something that's is really ambitious and cool is the idea of connecting, everything across the landscape for thousands of miles so that the black bear can find their way back here. It's really exciting. We're pretty much wrapping up. I have a few more slides. I want to share a little bit more about the Allegany Wildlands. And I think a lot of this is a really important place, and we have to raise the money this year with the community to protect it. So the 200-acre property that I had mentioned, we have to raise $879,000 by December 31st. But fortunately, I think because so many people in the community really care about this place, we are already 2/3 of the way there. And we have an exciting announcement tonight. So the Outside Chronicles, which is the organization, and Mike Radomski is who runs it. They run the Western New York Hiking Challenge. They were able to raise, through all of the people who participated in the hiking challenge, $40,000 for the Allegany Wildlands that they'll be donating. And what that means is that we have to raise, so of that $879,000, we still have to raise $290,000 by the end of the year. But because we have a challenge gift, there's still $80,000 left in the challenge gift. This was donated by the Linnaeus Foundation and the Gallagher Family Foundation. The next $80,000 in donations will be matched 1-to-1, which will double your gift. And so let me stop 1 second and turn it over to Kara, who's going to play a short little video from Mike about the hike challenge. Mike's been very important to this project and conservation in Western New York. And everyone who's participated in the hiking challenge has been donating basically to conservation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Radomski, and I'm from Outside Chronicles, and I run the Western New York Hiking Challenge. Sorry I couldn't be there tonight, but it's my son's last volleyball game, and it's a senior night, so obviously I'm there. I wanted to tell you real quick about the hiking challenge. We have over 5,500 hikers, and we've raised over $80,000 this year for 2 causes. One of those causes is the Western New York Land Conservancy's bid to buy the Allegany Wildlands. And the other cause is also very valuable to hikers, the Finger Lakes Trail Conference. So we're just wrapping that up. The hiking challenge ends November 19th. And I'm super excited to be donating the money to the Land Conservancy and can't wait to be hiking the Allegany Wildlands. Enjoy the rest of the presentation, and I'll see you guys outside.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you again, everyone who is part of that hiking challenge, who is donating to the Wildlands. We, like I said, we're very close. We need people in the community to help. We've done this, in past years with College Lodge or Mossy Point. People in the community always do step up and make this happen, but we're not there yet. And to save the Allegheny Wildlands, we need to raise another $290,000 before the year's over. So if you can, please do. It'd be very much appreciated. You can donate at our website, www.wnylc.org. You can send a check made payable to Western New York Land Conservancy and mail it to P.O. Box 471, East Aurora, New York, 14052. You can call if you have any questions. If you want to help, if you have ideas, our phone number is 716-687-1225. And I just want to end with this. So like I had mentioned, Eric Danielson, our ecologist, he visited this property last November. This is when we were just beginning to think about it, and we were trying to figure out, is it important? Is this a place that we should spend our time? Is this going to matter to the community? Is this place worth protecting? And, we weren't sure. And Eric went there and, he looked at it and he found a lot of really cool things. And like I had mentioned, he found an American chestnut tree. And I saw that map. I was looking at it after he had gone, and I was just, I said, there's an American chestnut tree there. And I'd never seen an American chestnut tree. So I thought, I should go try to find this tree. I would love to see this tree. This is really cool. This would be really cool to see. I know this history of the chestnut. It's really, kind of a sad story about the loss of something really important, really culturally important, ecologically important, but also the hope that we could bring this species back. And this property, this place could be part of that story. So I went with my wife, Anna. She'd never seen the chestnut either. When we pull up, this is an hour and a half from the city of Buffalo. It's a long drive. Get there. As soon as we get out of the car, these 2 bald eagles come swooping in, and they're coming in from the reservoir nearby. They're fishing in the reservoir. They come swooping in. They start flying through the trees, which I think is really odd. Usually you don't see them flying through the trees. One lands in a ravine not far from our car. This is very strange. First off, it's a good sign. You'll just go to a place trying to figure out if it matters, if it's important, and 2 bald eagles show up immediately, announcing themselves and showing off. It's like that. That's a sign for sure. But it was so weird that they're, one especially was going through the trees and landed in a ravine. They're usually at the top of trees or flying over water. So it was very strange, but good sign, very exciting. And so Anna and I, we set off with this map we had printed, looking for this one dot. It wasn't digital. I didn't have the GPS coordinates. I just saw there's a dot for some topography. Maybe I can find this chestnut tree. We're walking through the Allegheny Wildlands, up the hills, through the ravines. There's no trails. It's basically bushwhacking. And as we're going, I'm realizing that's going to be really hard for me to find. For one thing, I had forgotten to really look up, what does an American chestnut tree look like? What does its leaf look like? I said, I should have thought of this before I came out here. And two, it's like all the leaves on the trees had already fallen off anyways. So what are the chances that I'm going to be able to find this one tree, this one dot on a map? 2 hours in, we're coming back, we're near the car, we're in that ravine, where the bald eagles were flying. And my wife, we're seeing on the ground these leaves, these long serrated leaves. And I'm realizing it's just triggering a memory. Like, this is it. This is the American chestnut leaf, even if I'd forgotten to try to figure it out before I came out here. This is it. This is it. So we're getting excited. We're seeing them all over the ground. They're getting denser. But we're realizing too, they're all the leaves on the trees are gone. There's no chance I'm going to find the tree that this leaf comes from. So I'm probably not going to find this dot on the map. But my wife looks up at one tree, and there's one leaf left in the tree, and that's the American chestnut tree. And as I was walking back to the car, I realized that when we had arrived, that bald eagle that had been really weird and flying through the ravine and going through the trees instead of staying above and landing on top, that landed on the ground, it had landed right next to this American chestnut tree. And I don't know what that means. I don't know what the bald eagle was doing. I don't know if it was aware of it, but it just felt like it was trying to show us where this dot on the map was, where this chestnut tree was. It was saying, this place is important. This place matters. Let's protect it. And I think that's what we're going to be able to do. We need everyone in the community to help. This is a really important place. And I thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Ed, for presenting. And if you can donate to help save the Allegany Wildlands, please do. And thank you.